Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. We are back after our little mini hiatus that we had there because of that Western Standard episode was just so much work. I can't even tell you. And it's like having a massive bowel movement. And when it's done, it's just like, oh, I just need a minute. And now it's gone. Thank God. Flushed, dealt with, never have to be thought about again. So we're moving on by going a little bit backwards, if you will, because we have a guest tonight who's here to talk about a book that has to do with a big chunk of not only Alberta's political history, which is where we kind of eat, but also a little bit of the Canadian political history. The author of the new-ish book, Kenneyism. Well, excited to welcome to the show, Mr. Jeremy Appel.
Hey, great to be here, Nate. It's been a long time coming, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, we've run in the same sort of commentary circles for a few years now. And I know that we were talking before we started the interview proper. We met at one of the protests that was going on when the government was lifting restrictions for I think it might have even been a best summer ever run in. Um, I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think it was. It was 2021.
Yeah.
It must have
Uh,
been because yeah, because I was still at the sprawl.
See, now
Uh,
you're giving away all the questions that I'm going to ask because I want to get. I'm sure that there is a good portion of our audience that has a pretty good familiarity. You've managed to have a pretty big footprint in the Alberta politics commentary and journalism game, and so I'm pretty sure that most of our audience will be familiar with you. But for anybody who's listening to the show who isn't familiar with you, who is Jeremy Appel?
wow, that's a very philosophical question.
Isn't it?
Yeah, but okay, so the short answer is I'm an independent Edmonton based journalist. You might have read my work in various places, going back to the Medicine Hat News, the Sprawl, the Maple, the Breach, Ricochet. I actually got a New York Times byline recently, which is still quite surreal to say. So I've got my finger in a bunch of different pies, so to speak, journalistically. But I'm originally from Toronto, well, the greater Toronto area, from a suburb just north of the city. And I became a journalist. Well, I went to journalism school in 2014, I want to say. My goal was to get a journalism job near home. When that didn't really pan out, I sort of started applying for jobs everywhere and anywhere I could in Canada. And I wound up in a small town called Whitecourt and was there for 6 months. I mean, it was an incredible culture shock. Moving from the suburbs of Toronto to Whitecourt. And one memory that really stands out in my mind, in particular, is that when I was moving into my apartment, I looked across the street, and in a basement apartment in the building across the street from me, uh tenant had a Confederate flag in their window. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm not in the South. What's going on here? And yeah, this small town life wasn't for me ultimately. And I wound up getting a job at the Medicine Hat News, which is, I think, where my work caught a lot of people's attention, especially compared to my tiny audience prior. Myself and Scott Schmidt were writing opinion columns that were the types of things you wouldn't be reading with any regularity at the post media dominated outlets in Alberta. And then the pandemic happened, and it was a pivotal moment, I think, in my career, as well as Jason Kenney's, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I got laid off at the Medicine Hat News. I know there were some conspiracies percolating that they were trying to silence me, and trust me, if that were the case, I would be the first person to say that. But yeah, no, it was just a temporary pandemic layoff, and so I would have never imagined myself being a freelance or an independent journalist full time before that, but circumstances sort of forced me into that. And I was fortunate to have government assistance for 6 months, I believe it was. And that, yeah, that allowed me to take some risks and start freelancing. A bunch of exciting new independent media outlets were starting and growing. And one of them was the Sprawl. I ended up getting a job there covering Calgary City Hall, which lasted a year. And then there was some downsizing, to make a long story short. And Jeremy Clausis, the founder there, didn't want to sort of be in charge of like a full-blown like news organization like I think he had originally conceived of the Sprawl growing into. And no real hard feelings in that. I think again, it was something where circumstances gave me an opportunity to be fully independent. I now have a newsletter on Substack called The Orchard, where I kind of just write about whatever I want to write about, including Alberta politics often. And now I live here in the capital in Edmonton. And that is, I think, a very abbreviated version of my story.
I mean, we could just cut past all of it and just say you're a Laurentian elite, couldn't we?
I mean, yeah, and that would be true, but I'm not the only one, it turns out.
Yeah, well, um, that's where I have some questions that I want to ask about, some of those side ventures because it wasn't just the Medicine Hat News, which had some editorials that absolutely blew up during the Kenney era. Um, but you also had the multimedia experience that was the Forgotten Corner as well. Um, and I mean, I listened, I enjoyed. It has now come to, is it an end? Is it a break? Is it
No, it's an end. Scott and I, who's still a great friend of mine, uh, and really, I think, looking back into my sort of evolution as a journalist and a writer was, I think, one of my key influences in pushing me not to beat around the bush and to say what I mean what I say, and not and have confidence that if I'm genuine, that will resonate with people. But yeah, so we shortly after I got laid off at news, me and Scott and Mo Cranker, who is our producer, who was also a reporter at the Medicine Hat News, who got laid off alongside me. I believe they brought him back for a bit um, after the temporary layoff, and then he got a communications job with the city. Yeah, we started this podcast to do sort of like an interview format type show. I really like Mark Maron, WTF. I like his style of interviewing, how he goes deep with people and tries to get them to open up. And sometimes he's really successful at that, and other times his guests won't do it. But it's always really interesting to listen to. And we our focus was largely on Alberta politics, but we had a few episodes on other topics. I mean, one of our later episodes, we had Andrew Stoughton on, who's a baseball reporter slash columnist, I guess you could say, on Substack in Toronto. And we talked about baseball. And yeah, it was I'm really happy with the what we were able to do with that show for the few years, I guess it was, in its existence. And it was also for like a year and a half, maybe 2 years, we were consistently doing an episode a week. And full credit to Mo for that. He was like the sergeant, like always keeping us in line and making sure that he had the episode edited in time to come out every week. And yeah, no, but it was Scott, I think, has been given a lot more responsibility in the newsroom at the Medicine Hat News. And with I think we both know, it's no secret that there are fewer and fewer media jobs in newsrooms in Canada, and not just in Canada, but it's especially apparent here where we live. And the and the remaining employees are just expected to do more and more with less and less resources. So it came a time where we were barely recording episodes. And I remember, and it was very sporadically. And then I pitched to Scott. I was like, "Hey, what the hell's going on in Medicine Hat with city council and the mayor losing all her powers?" We had the mayor on shortly after she was elected. And then Scott said, "Look, I've been meaning to talk to you about this. Like, I just don't think we I have the time for this podcast anymore." And I was like, "You know what? Let's do it like Beatles style. Like, this is our rooftop concert, and this is I don't actually think our output is comparable to the Beatles, but let's just do this one last hurrah and bring it all back home to Medicine Hat, where Scott still lives, and where we started." And yeah, we had a good discussion about that. But spoiler alert, no one knows what the hell happened at Medicine Hat City Hall. I'm sure the dwindling amount of people in media remaining in the city are hopefully filing FOIPs and trying to find out what the hell happened, because it's a weird one. And we were also because we also talked about in the context of this clear in you've talked about it a lot, Nate. This clear effort by the UCP to interfere in local municipal politics, right? Both overtly through legislation and also through its proxies like Take Back Alberta. And what's interesting is what happened in Medicine Hat seems to be totally unrelated to that, which I felt was kind of surprising. But um but yeah, that is in a nutshell the story of the beginning and end of the Forgotten Corner.
Well, let's talk about the book. That's the big reason we're here. Um, the book is Kenneyism, Jason Kenney's Pursuit of Power. And it's got an interesting, full disclosure. I said this to you before we started. I've been working my way through it. It's not a light tome. though. You got some weight to it. There's some page numbers and everything in here. Uh, it, it tells the story of Jason Kenney kind of from the very, very early years. And there were some anecdotes that you had in there that I was reading and I was like, really? Um, uh, I I remember very clearly he made a reference early on in his premiership to something to do with punk rock. And I was like, oh, hell no, you didn't. Like, you are not punk rock. In no universe is Jason Kenney in any way. He does not get anywhere near close to laying claim to anything to do with punk rock. But there's just a little bit of like this pseudo punk rock history to Jason Kenney that's like, what? It blew my mind. So, but before we get into all of that kind of stuff, what made you want to write a book? I mean, writing a book is no small endeavor, I imagine. Um, and to write a book about a figure like Jason Kenney, what was the impetus for that? What made you go, hey, you know what I want to do with all of my free time?
I mean, that's pretty much what it was for a few months. Was I mean, it was like my white whale, uh, right? And so the reason I decided to write a book about Jason Kenney in particular is I mean, for starters, I moved to Alberta in the winter of 2017, right? This wasn't exactly the beginning of Kenney's efforts in Alberta politics to unite the right, but it was in its early stages, right? A month after I arrived in March 2017, he wins the PC leadership on a one note platform. Let's get rid of this party and merge with the Wild Rose. And so and as a journalist in Alberta who lived in different parts of the province throughout the years in question, which make up about half the book. I dedicate essentially half the book to sort of the lead up to Jason Kenney's premiership, going back, as you said, to the very beginning to his downfall. And I thought it was interesting this rise of Jason Kenney that I witnessed. I was like, this guy's going to be premier forever. And I you know, I think, full disclosure, I'm not a fan of the guy. Um, and then to just see all this goodwill he earned, not of course among people like me and you, and you know, our sort of the progressive Alberta Twitter sphere, but among people who believed in him on the right, and to just see all that goodwill evaporate so quickly was remarkable. I mean, I still remember I figured Kenney would get like the bare minimum he needed in the leadership review to justify staying on, and he would do it and then win re-election and then go off to the private sector or go back to Ottawa perhaps. But no, I mean he barely got a majority, and I think that it was a really interesting ending to the political career of somebody who I think in my lifetime was one of the most influential figures in Canada's conservative movement. And I think that there's a lot of aspects of Kenney or Kenneyism that is very emblematic of the broader conservative movement in Canada, in the United States, that I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. But there are also things about him that are very unique. And chief among those is that he's a really weird guy. Like, he is unusual. I mean, he is a devout Roman Catholic, but he also loves the British crown. And he's throughout his career, I think he's really cultivated this aura of mystery around him, right? I mean, he's a single guy who is, by all accounts, very hard worker. Like he is. I mean, his life, I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say, is consumed by politics. And yeah, there's something just really interesting to me, not just about the political forces that Kenney exemplifies, which I do find interesting, but also where he stands apart from his peers. Another, and I think one innovation that Kenney brought to this sort of populist conservative politics in Canada was this embrace of immigrants, right? And other diverse communities that were just sort of written off by the Reform Party. I mean, you have to remember the Reform Party in its earliest iteration, right, in the late 80s, when it started making waves, was explicitly anti-immigrant. They wanted to bring less immigrants into Canada. And Kenney, even back when he was with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, when he was their executive director, and Harper was a Reform MP, he told Harper, he was like, if you want to create a governing coalition for reform, you need to reach out to immigrants, because immigrant communities are like anyone else. I mean, there are conservative elements within those communities that would fit in with our party ideologically, right? A lot of immigrants like low taxes. They support harsher criminal justice measures, right? And also support tighter restrictions on the types of new immigrants we're letting into the country. And so I think that is actually quite remarkable, especially if you look at the context of the global populist right with Donald Trump and his enablers in the Republican Party in the States. It's very explicitly anti-immigrant. Whereas Kenney and Harper embraced this, was like, no, we need immigrants. It's just I don't think that this means they're not racist. I think there are ways in which they essentialize immigrant communities that is that is demeaning, but it's one in which they recognize that without, like, the Reform Party and its antecedents were never going to get a lot of support in Quebec. And that was a key part of Brian Mulroney's majority PC coalition, right? Was this alliance between Quebec nationalists, business interests in Montreal and Toronto, and Western populists in BC and especially Alberta. And Reform was never going to get the Quebec nationalists on side. So it became a matter of targeting these suburban communities outside of Toronto and Vancouver with lots of immigrant populations and cultivating ties with like-minded elements in these communities and showing up at their events, right? That was a big part of it. Like the Reform and then the Alliance, they just weren't showing up because they're like, oh, these people don't vote for us. But it's like, no, they can vote for you because there are elites within every community that have views that are completely consistent with conservative politics in Canada. And if I could just add one last thing that I think is especially interesting about Kenney, is his approach in an interesting, I'm saying in a neutral way, not that I endorse it by any stretch of the imagination, is his approach to the drug poisoning crisis, and putting this veneer of compassion on these same old failed drug war policies, right? By ushering in this recovery oriented system of care, right? So then it becomes, oh, we're not just locking up addicts, right? We're not doing mass incarceration, even though we are by different means. We're giving people an opportunity, people who have sinned, an opportunity to set themselves on the path of righteousness. And so I think there's also a very interesting connection between this recovery centric approach to drug policy and his religious beliefs that you've seen, of course, Danielle Smith only deepen.
Yeah.
And you see Polyev embracing it on a federal level, though he's been awfully quiet about it since the overdose numbers have gone back up to worse than they were prior to um the few months where overdoses were down.
I mean, it's interesting that you talk about Jason Kenney and his embracing of the newer immigrant communities is how I'd probably phrase it. Because, as you were talking there, I was thinking back to the first time that I ever met Jason Kenney, and that was at a Red FM Stampede breakfast. I want to say it would have been 2018. And he was there, and I was struck by how uncomfortable he looked in sort of denim. And how aggressively he was working the room. I mean, there were a lot you see a lot of politicians who attend events and they'll kind of do like I'm here for 20 minutes, guys, and they go in and they quickly do the thing that they were tasked to do, and they might shake a couple of hands on the way in and the way out. But Kenny, he was there for the whole event pretty much, and he worked that room very, very impressively. And I think that that's a big part of what his appeal to a lot of people was, is that he would, if you ended up in the same room as Jason Kenney, and or you were at a social function and your name wasn't Jeremy Appel, then he would spend lots of time talking to you. That's a reference to the introduction of your book. Um, Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the bigger themes of the book, because you kind of unpacked the mind of Jason Kenney a little bit there. And one of the things that's always struck me, and I haven't been able to vocalize or verbalize very well, is I think that one of the big things that appeals to Kenny is the sense of structure and hierarchy and all the right things in all of the right places. And if you step out of the right things in the right places, then you must be whacked back into place as aggressively as need be. And I think that's part of why he struggled so much with COVID, because the man does not seem to do particularly well with elements of chaos. But you take it a step further in the book, and you actually compare and contrast these two political and social, big important distinction there, ideologies. Um, and the two words that I'm hoping that you can spend a little bit of time talking about are the neoliberalism and the neoconservatism. Because when you say Jason Kenney is a neoliberal and Jason Kenney is a neoconservative, everybody goes, that doesn't make any sense. Jason
Yeah,
Kenney.
how could you be both?
Yeah, like that's not a thing. So we'll go through each of them one at a time, and you do it for anybody who wants to spend a little bit more time on it. Jeremy does an incredible job of sort of fleshing out these ideas in the book and applying them to Kenny's behavior. But let's start with neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism?
So neoliberalism is the dominant economic ideology of our time. I mean, there's some considerable debate over whether we're still in the neoliberal age or not, but this was an economic philosophy that came about in the late 1970s, in 1980s, in 1990s that suggests the private sector and individual actors are the most effective economic actors in society. So the goal of a government is to just get out of the way, right? It's small government is I guess what you could say in short, right? And the important thing to note about this, because I think people can be confused by the use of the word liberalism in it, is that this was a cross partisan consensus, right? You saw Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher really reducing the capacity of their respective states to provide for their citizens and offloading responsibility for these onto individual actors. You also saw the liberals and the Democrats in the states under Bill Clinton facilitate the same offloading of the states um responsibilities since really the Second World War, where in part because of the Cold War, because there was competition from a differing economic system, elites in the Western world decided that actually there is a role for the government to play in providing things for people. Things, I mean, the States is a different beast, but here in Canada, right? Healthcare, education, culture through the CBC, right? So all this starts to get dismantled in the late 1970s. And so that's what neoliberalism is, right? When you hear conservative, but also more progressive politicians, though they're less full throat about it, talk about how government isn't the solution to these problems and that we need to reduce the deficit and debt and that taxes are too high and that people serving in government have too many perks or are just getting paid too much. That's reflective of the neoliberal ideology, right? Just sort of, yeah, offloading the state's responsibilities on to for-profit companies, not-for-profits, charities, churches, right? In individuals, families. That right. Margaret Thatcher famously said, I think this is a phrase that really encapsulates the spirit of neoliberalism. There's no society. There's only individuals in their families, and they're responsible to themselves, right? And so that's what neoliberalism is, in short.
You could almost say neoliberalism, I think, if you think about it in the sense of, a lot of people, the way that I kind of connected the dots in my head, which is probably clumsy and not at all accurate. But the way that I connected the dots in my head is that if you think about the general understanding of liberalism as, I'll just let it all hang out, man, uh, then it is that approach applied to capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, and what I think is also might be somewhat confusing to people is that's called neoliberalism, when in actuality it's a return to the classical liberalism that was embodied by philosophers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, where private property in protecting it from the state is placed at the forefront of all these other individual liberties like freedom of expression and um um right, like that is so it's in a sense a reversion, and it was actually an anomaly, the sort of what I call in the book progressive liberalism, but I mean, it's also been called welfare state liberalism, Keynesianism. That was anomalous, right? Historically, it was, if anything, conservatives, classical conservatives, who wanted more state involvement in economic matters. And it was liberals who wanted sort of individuals freed from the shackles of the state.
So with neoliberalism, we're talking economics. What are we talking when we're talking neoconservatism?
Right. So neoconservatism is as you suggested, neoliberalism is an economic philosophy. Neoconservatism is a social philosophy, right? We're not talking about property rights per se. We're talking about things like values and traditions and mores. And neoconservatives, like classical conservatives, are much more open to the role of the state when it comes to promoting a particular uh, order that is rooted in tradition and hierarchy and is often religious or at least conducive towards religiosity. And what's interesting about neocons, and I think the phrase is most commonly used as distinct from neoliberalism when we're talking about foreign policy, right? When we're talking about the Bush administration, right? In going and invading Iraq and trying to, so they said, bring democracy to Iraq, right? To export our values through the barrel of a gun. And the reason I think that that's instructive is that's also sort of how it manifests itself domestically when you're looking at these harsh criminal justice policies, like the recovery oriented system of care. That's also like these people, these individuals are, there's chaos and disorder on the streets, and we need the state to bring order and promote morality, right? And these individuals are behaving immorally, right? I mean, as you know, Nate, this conservative drug policy is incredibly moralistic, right? Like, it's not about keeping people alive; it's about making people behave in a traditionally ethical um, matter. And so and so these aren't now in theory, right? Like neoconservatism is collectivist, it's statist, whereas neoliberalism is more, as you suggested, libertarian and freewheeling and individualist. But the interesting thing is when we're talking about the sort of values that neoconservatives attempt to impose on society, one of them would is often neoliberal economics. Now, I think that's changing a bit. There's this book. I forget the guy's name. He spoke at like the Manning conference or whatever it's called now in Ottawa, called Tyranny Inc. And it's like this conservative case that's being made against unchecked corporate power. And you see that too with like Ron DeSantis, right? About how Disney is woke and it's an affront to our values. And so there's some evolution in that. But if we're going to like a neoconservative like Jason Kenney or George W. Bush, I mean, a key part of this moral order that they want to uphold through the force of the state is neoliberal economics, except of course when neoliberal economics doesn't serve to uphold traditional centers of authority, like say the oil and gas industry here in Alberta. Then Kenney had no problem jettisoning those free market principles to spend more than $1 billion on the Keystone XL pipeline. Right. And I mean, that is when you see sort of the neoconservative social philosophy step in as a result of the failures of neoliberalism on its own terms. Right.
The book is fascinating because excuse me, once you get past the first couple of pages, which are sort of the reviews and then the copyright and the it has to have one of the most jarring lines I think that you could write in a book about Alberta politics for anybody who's like alive right now. Um, because the introduction, the foreword is written by David Clement Haga, and the very first line of text is nobody misses Jason Kenney.
Yeah, that was great. I was really happy with his
And I mean the rest of the introduction is of the forward is fantastic, but like I kind of wonder if that's still true.
I mean that's a good point. I think as we bear witness to the chaos and the authoritarianism of the Smith years and the corruption, I think it is tempting. And I've heard people say this who, in my view, ought to know better to say, oh, well, Jason Kenney's reign was calm by comparison. And I think that this is a good example of the perils of nostalgia, right? To just look back at the past and ignore all the bad things that happened, right? I mean, before we started recording, we were talking about how the 90s was the best time for popular culture in human history, and I think it was. But it's also, we were talking about the 90s, 90s is a very different experience if you're in Bosnia or Somalia, right?
Yeah.
Um and but I think in the case of Kenney, the I mean, I think there's such a clear line between what he the forces that he cultivated when he came back to Alberta from federal politics. Because when he was a cabinet minister, he barely spent time in Calgary. It was in Ottawa, and then it was in like Brampton, in Surrey, in all these suburban areas with large immigrant communities, Markham, right? And um, because the very forces that Kenney cultivated to come to power are the ones who turned on him and promoted Smith. And so if Kenney were in this parallel universe where Kenney wasn't turfed by his own party, I think he would be doing almost everything that Danielle Smith is doing now, especially the anti-trans stuff. I think Kenney really wishes um, he had the political capital to have done that when he did, though. Again, he paved the way for it with you remember on the campaign trail in 2018 he was saying teachers are keeping secrets from parents. Isn't
Oh,
that
there's no question.
right?
I,
The
I've
GSA stuff.
I've said for quite some time that, you know, when I think of Jason Kenney, especially when the leadership review was going on, he was like the kid who was confidently playing with matches near the drapes, convinced that he'd be able to manage the small fire, and he lit the drapes on fire. And you could see almost the expression on his face. There was one press conference in particular where he was asked if he was concerned about the all of the work that he had done being undone by the forces that he had unleashed. And you could see like Kenny was somebody who was very quick with an answer. There was not a whole lot of you ask Jason Kenney a question and then you wait 5 seconds. And that was the first time in a press conference that I could remember seeing him like, the drapes are on fire and really like getting it. Um, that was I think the difference between Kenny and Smith is that Kenny thought that he could control the fire. And I think that Danielle Smith hasn't figured out that gasoline is flammable and she's running around with a super soaker full of it.
Well, it's not that she hasn't figured it out. It's that she's not sure because she read on the internet
Yeah, there you go.
that it's actually the World Economic Forum and George Soros and the Rockefellers that are setting these fires, and it's not actually matches, right? And or drapes. But no, but that's interesting too, because I think like Kenney actually believes a lot of this shit.
Yeah.
Smith, I don't think Smith has many core beliefs. Like, yeah, she believes in neoliberalism, but she's not a neoconservative,
No.
right? Right. That and that's what one thing that I've David Parker is,
And Rob
right?
Anderson is.
And Rob Anderson, all these forces of the religious right that she is beholden to are. But she herself, I don't I don't think she cares about all this culture war nonsense. Kenney does. Kenney, like that is deep seated in him. The one thing he wouldn't have done is the Alberta Sovereignty Act stuff, right?
Yep.
I mean, he was explicit, and he deliberately timed his announcing that he was stepping down from his seat in Calgary Lougheed to be when Smith introduced the Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act. But the thing with that is the Alberta Sovereignty Act is pure theatrics, right? By Smith's own admission, it doesn't actually do anything. So if you look at what Smith's actually doing, these are all things that were started by Kenney. I mean, this pension plan, uh, provincial police force, and I don't think Kenney believed in those things. The real populist stuff, right? The that I mean, Jason Kenney has nothing but disdain for like the common man, right? I'm sure, I don't think he sees it that way. I think he believes in this rigidly hierarchical order where everyone knows their place, including common people, right? But I mean, the all the the stuff that goes back to the firewall letter, right? You remember that
Oh yeah.
with Tom Flanagan and Stephen Harper before he returned to politics. We're saying we need to like build a firewall between Alberta and the rest of the country to sort of create um this like libertarian utopia in Alberta. And they asked Ralph Klein to do a bunch of things, and Ralph Klein was like, "No, I'm good," essentially. And but Kenney, when he came back, revived all these things, right? As under the guise of, oh, we need a fair deal from Ottawa. Well, you were just in Ottawa. You spent the last 20 years of your life in Ottawa. And now you're saying that you are going to stand up to the Ottawa elites. And no one bought that. No one bought that. Right. It's just, I think, I mean, maybe some people did, but people who are part of that movement, like a guy like Derek Fildebrandt, who I know you've been talking a bit about lately. I interviewed him for the book, and I don't think he thought that Jason Kenney was this authentic cowboy hat wearing, blue truck driving, jean jacket wearing Alberta firster. It was Kenney was a conduit to get these ideas into the mainstream. He would make them electable. And then the hope was that he would at least make some movement on these things and sort of shift the Overton window ever so slightly in their favored direction. But then, and I mean, again, if you look at the first year, or rather, not even the first year, the first few months when the UCP were in power, all the things they did were unifying policies that I think both factions of the conservative movement in Alberta could get behind. And that was just embracing this neoliberal economics, right? Cutting corporate taxes, or at least beginning the process of cutting them to make them the lowest in Canada by far. Um, creating a two-tiered minimum wage, rolling back all these like occupational health and safety measures, making it harder to unionize, right? These were unifying things that it didn't matter whether you were a staunch federalist who loves the monarchy like Jason Kenney, or you were Derek Fildebrandt or Danielle Smith who wanted to burn it all down. Like that was your that's great. That's what you want, right? Either way, that is the no matter how you slice it. I mean, that's a key component, I think, of modern conservatism is to empower big business and to make it harder for their employees to exercise collective power to challenge it, right? But then the pandemic comes, and I think that brings a whole other element to the tensions within Kenney's caucus regarding restrictions and no restriction, like basically no restrictions at all, or the bare minimum, too little, too late, which was Kenney's approach. And also, the same people he was infuriating by imposing the bare minimum COVID restrictions when it was too little, too late. We're also saying, hey, hang on a minute. What happened to all this fair deal panel stuff, right? Like Drew Barnes, for example, who is emblematic of um, this, I think, mentality, right? Of that, and was totally spurned by Kenney because he outlived his usefulness to him. And so the pandemic, this sort of live free or die mentality, if you will, during the pandemic, this livelihoods and freedoms compared to what Kenney was saying about lives and livelihoods, really combined with this Alberta sovereignty sentiment in a way that created this perfect storm for Brian Jean and then Danielle Smith to make their political comeback. In Jean's case, I mean, it must have been incredibly sweet for him to take his revenge after Kenney humiliated him in the UCP leadership race, whether fairly or not. I'm not going to say, but um, but nonetheless, because right, I mean, Kenney comes back from Ottawa, and Brian Jean, who look, I don't like Brian Jean, I don't agree with him on anything, but it was impressive how he was able to turn around the Wild Roses' fortunes after Smith abandoned them. And he really took the mantle of this right wing movement in Alberta. And then Kenney comes back and he's like, no, 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 no. I'm in charge. Who the hell are you? Right. And yeah, I can imagine I think Gene had political smarts in that sense to realize that this was the pandemic was the perfect storm for him to come back and say, oh, now who's the leader of the movement? And then, of course, he didn't actually win the leadership race. But I mean, him and Smith agreed on more than they didn't.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting is, as you're talking, there's a couple of things that I want to try to unpack a little bit. Um, as you're talking about the firewall letter, it was 2001. It was a liberal federal government. And so it seems like one of the things that Alberta is really good at, and I say that this is someone who's been born and raised in this province for whatever that counts for, which I hope would be nothing. Uh, but I feel like I just have to just, own that reality. But it seems like one of the shticks that Alberta conservatives are very good at using, and this is something that Kenney used without the foresight to recognize. Again, you're lighting the drapes on fire. Is when there's a liberal government in Ottawa, that's when we're going to play the Alberta victimhood card as hard as we possibly can. And the problem with that is that once that toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't really, you can kind of be like, oh, let's just let it dry and go to the other room for a bit. But it still exists. And I think that one of the things that happened, has happened repeatedly in Alberta, is we have a province that when there's a liberal government, the conservatives go, "Oh, Alberta, we're just so screwed," and they fire up this narrative of, despite the fact that we're basically the best off province in the country more often than not. They fire up this narrative that we're the great victims of the Ottawa oppressors, and I think one of the dangers of that narrative that Kenney leaned into. I mean, the firewall letter sort of set the stage, and then Kenney was like, "Oh, that worked for a while," and I think he kind of jumped on it a bit. But it almost seems like there was no consideration for, if you constantly say Alberta's being treated unfairly by Ottawa, and you don't say the Liberals because you want to play it smart politically, eventually Albertans are going to start to believe that Alberta is being treated unfairly by Ottawa. Um, so it's it's again, it's that idea of, well, we had something that was it worked in the moment, and oops, well, now we have a problem. And you take a look at Kenny's attempts to lean into the populism, which you discuss in the book. The big blue truck is obviously a really easy example of that. Um, but
It's
it
so
seems,
over the top.
yeah, totally over the top because he doesn't get it. The idea that anybody would believe that somebody who dresses in that kind of denim drives that kind of truck is going to be like, okay, cute. That's very cute. But it gave people enough of the excuse to go, yeah, oh gosh, she's good. That's a nice truck. Um, but the other thing that I think is interesting is, if I was to, and this was one of the things I was really looking forward to getting your thoughts on, because you've done such a deep dive on Kenney in this book. If I was to juxtapose, I was originally just going to do Smith, but you threw Brian Jean into the mix, and I think that he's a good example too. Brian Jean and Danielle Smith, in many ways, seem to be sort of empty vessels. And this is something even Thomas Lukasik, when we've had him on the show, he's reiterated this multiple times. Danielle Smith is great with the script, but as soon as you take it away from her, she stares at you like a dog just shown a card trick. Um, so you juxtapose that with Kenney, and one of the things that I found very interesting was when, at one point in the earlier chapters in the book, you talk about how there was a debate in, I think it was high school, where Kenney shined. He
Yeah,
came
yeah,
to
yeah. It was a model parliament.
yeah. And that to me, I think, is the biggest difference, because to me, Brian Jean and Danielle Smith on their own, they show up and they've got like cap guns. Whereas Kenney shows up and he's got a Gatling gun fully loaded and also some rocket launchers and a flamethrower, and he's made sure that they're all well oiled and ready to go. There's a significant difference there, and that is not to say that, uh, gosh, Kenney was great, because nope. Um, but when you compare the orders of magnitudes of minds at work, I think that there's a big difference between those and Jason Kenney.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Kenney. I mean, I don't think anyone would deny that Kenney is very smart, very, as you suggested earlier, quick on his feet, and he knows, he's read all the classics of political literature, right? Like he has a firm sense of what he believes politically. And I think the thing about populism, and again, Kenney has always used the language of populism to promote a set of policies that are fundamentally elitist. But in order to really thrive as a populist, you do have to be somewhat of an empty vessel, right? Because it's what do the people want? Who cares about me? Right? I mean, Bernie Sanders, for example, right, would say, not not me, us, right? And obviously that's you can't be a pure populist because you need to have some sort of vision and program that you're rallying people behind. But like Kenney has this sort of unbridled arrogance that I think also in conjunction with his intellect make him unique compared with many of his peers in Canada's conservative movement. And it was and this arrogance was when he famously said when the UCP voted in favor of outing kids who are in GSAs, and he was like, well, guess what, I have the pen, I hold the pen, I
Yeah.
make decisions. And he just ran on the grassroots guarantee. And then he's like, oh, hold on just a sec, grassroots guarantee doesn't mean that I'm just going to let you plebs write policy. No, 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 that's my job. But yeah, I'll listen and I'll take your input. And I think someone like Danielle Smith or Brian Jean is, yeah, a much more empty vessel. And I think that in a sense, if we're looking at it from perspective as a progressive, I mean, that's a weakness on Smith's part, because she can be swayed, right? I mean, there's a reason Danielle Smith reversed the de-indexing of H, right? Or brought back the cap on auto insurance rate hikes, right? It's because she has a lack of firm ideological commitments that would be totally foreign to Jason Kenney. And now, of course, with Kenney, you see over the years, especially when he's on the federal level, and it's becoming clear the Conservative Party of Canada might actually win this thing, right? In 2004 and then 2006, when they do, he learns how to sort of temper some of his more radical political instincts that would be an electoral liability, and to sort of make these strategic retreats in favor of the grander project that Harper, and it was Harper, of course, who came to the party from, I mean, he was a Reform MP and then he left politics and worked for the National Citizens Coalition and came back and was like, all right, social conservative stuff, you can, what, we want nothing to do with that. We're going to talk about cutting taxes, lowering the deficit, and supporting American imperial power in the realm of foreign policy, and changing the configuration of immigration, of immigrants that we're bringing into Canada. And I and so I think Kenney did learn from this pragmatism that was promoted by Harper. And but you saw the limits of that pragmatism in 2015, right? When these dog whistles about barbaric cultural practices and locking up foreign criminals and all these things just boomerang back on them in this veneer of inclusivity that they had promoted as this new immigrant friendly conservative party was reversed, and they were again seen as the same old ogurely conservative party that is for rich white guys.
What do you think do you think that switch will flip for Smith? Because she's leaned into the and it almost seems like, there's this grounds, I don't know if you can call it a swell yet, but it's working on it, of the far right elements that Smith courted in order to get the leadership. It seems like, she's trying to be like, okay, everybody, let's work our way back to being more reasonable, okay? Um, and I think that because she's lit a far bigger fire than Kenny ever did, she's going to have a much bigger, much harder time putting that genie back in the bottle or the toothpaste in the tube or whatever you want to say. Do you see it flipping on her as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. My hesitance to say yes is, I think, based on Alberta's somewhat unique political climate. Like, I think Kenney learned that it's not like moderate people in the big cities who may be moderately conservative but are freaked out to varying degrees about the social conservative and the Alberta First stuff. It's the Alberta First people you need to keep happy to stay in charge of the party, and then when it comes to election time, you just the people who you've alienated through that just offer to cut their taxes, right? And through all these other appeals to sort of individual self-interest that will offset that. And so I don't know if it will blow up in Smith's face in the same way it did for Harper in 2015. And it surely isn't going to blow up in her face the way it did for Kenney. Not that she isn't necessarily going to implode at some point in the near future, but it won't be because she alienated the party's far right activist populist wing. If anything, it would come from the opposite. But I'm just not, and maybe this is just as an outsider, even though I've lived here for like 7 years as like a relative outsider, I'm just not confident making that bald making a bald assertion either way. But
I just look,
I
we go through conservative premiers like paper cups in this world,
yeah,
with the exception of,
yeah.
like I think Klein had probably one of the longest dynasties, he said cautiously, but with the exception of that, it has been a here's your spot in the revolving door, enjoy your 8 minutes. And it almost seems like that revolving door has been picking up speed.
Yeah, I mean that's true. Like you besides Lougheed and Klein, everyone else, had their 15 minutes. Like how did Stelmach finish a full term?
No,
No, yeah. And
I'm
and
pretty sure the
so
only premier that has actually finished a full term in the last 20 years. And I'm welcome to being fact checked on this, but I'm pretty sure that it's not like.
yeah, I that sounds right to me too. I think so. And it'll be interesting too with Nenshi, who I think is almost certainly going to win the NDP leadership race. I don't think it's going to be close. I think he would be an interesting foil to Danielle Smith. But I, yeah, you know, I, I'm loath to make predictions. Um, because even if your prediction turns out right, it will be right in a way where you still look stupid. So, um, but I mean, yes, there is the possibility because another factor that is sort of constantly moving is the fact that Alberta is changing, right? And has been since I've been here, right? It's increasingly diverse, it's increasingly young, it's increasingly urban. And so that also might play a role. But I think one thing that's interesting about Smith, I think, is that she has a desire to be liked.
Oh, more than anything. That's the
Yeah.
whole I think there are people who get into politics, and I would argue that Kenny would be one of those who get into it because they are political animals. They believe in the order out of the chaos. They believe in the hierarchy. And then there are people who just want to sit at the cool kids table. And I think that Danielle Smith is somebody who is desperate. And the thing that drives me crazy about her is you can see it in her pictures. Like she'll go to an event and the expression that she has on her face 9 times out of 10 comes off to me like she's going like, can you believe this is happening? Uh,
Well, have you seen that photo of her with the fun dip? You know what I'm talking about?
Fun dip? I don't think I have.
I think it was the oh, there it is. Yeah. It's the feature image for a Max Fawcett column, but it's a photo of Danielle just posing with a pack of Fun Dip with like her mouth open and just like doing a fun pose. And anyways, it's a great photo. Um, but yeah, Kenny is a lot more serious and reflective and ideological, right? Smith is ideological in the sense that she's surrounded by ideologues. And she, I think, agrees with a lot of what David Parker and Rob Anderson and that crowd is selling. But it's not like a firm part of her existence. You know what I mean? Like it is for
Yeah.
Kenny, who is like Kenny wanted to. I mean, Kenny wanted to become a priest, but when he was a teenager, and the the monastery near where his grandfather, who we haven't even talked about yet, Mart, who you might know from the social studies curriculum here, wouldn't have him because they're like, no, you're too young to make this serious of a commitment. But I think that's something that stuck with him for a while and reveals this really militant Catholic turn he takes when he goes off to university in San Francisco. And Danielle Smith's equivalent of that is, hanging out with like Ezra Levant and Nahid Nenshi and Stephen Harper at University of Calgary, right?
Yeah.
Like I think she's a much more social being than Jason Kenney.
I think the difference between Smith and Kenny is Kenny believes he's the foremost expert. And I think Smith will allow anybody to assert that they're an expert in the thing. And she goes, okay. And I think we saw this in the consultations that she did with the horrifying trans policies. I think we've seen this. I think that she believes that Rob Anderson is just a brilliant mind. I think she thinks that Ezra Levant is just a brilliant mind. And when you see that, she will in her mind identify somebody as, oh, they're the expert in this thing because they have this one piece of lived experience or they have this series of letters behind their name, whether or not they lost their medical license doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But she goes, that person is going to be my expert. And that's where she gets her information from. I mean, the number of people who have said, if you want to make sure that you influence Danielle Smith's policy, be the last person that she spoke to on the subject is really really quite telling. And I think that that's to me that seems like it's the biggest and you know what has struck me about your book is that you almost have there's almost a little bit, and I don't know if it's intentional, but there's almost a sympathetic tone uh, in how you've written it in regards to like here's a guy who um I'm going to paraphrase something that I'm pretty sure I read in the book, but he wants to always be the smartest person in the room. And in many areas, he has done the work to ensure that he can carry that confidence. But I think the pitfall that he ran into is that it's really easy to be the smartest person in a room when you're in a room full of people who aren't that smart. And
Well, actually, yeah, Raheem Jaffer actually told me that, and I think this quote always stands out to me because it's yes, Jason does want to be the smartest person in the room, but that's not enough. He also wants everyone to know that he's the smartest
yes,
person,
yeah,
right? And yeah, I interviewed Raheem Jaffer pretty late in the process of writing the book, and when he said that to me, I'm like, I am putting that like near the front
I think
because
it's in your
I think
profile.
that nails it. Yeah, 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 yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, just and I think you make a very good point. I hadn't considered with Smith, where she isn't as enamored with herself, but is easily convinced by someone who claims to be an expert and says a lot of things that sound plausible, that sound smart to her. And she's like, well, we got to listen to these experts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that that is a very good contrast between the two. Um,
Like
but yeah,
the way that
sorry,
I
go
would
ahead.
juxtapose the two is I think that Kenny wanted to be the expert on all the things. And I think we saw this during COVID when he was like, let me stand up with my little stick and I'll point at the board and explain epidemiology and virology to you, even though there's Dr. Henshaw over there and she could do it way better. Um, I think that he wants to be seen as the expert, whereas Danielle Smith wants to be seen as the person who listens because that way you'll like her.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I think the pandemic was a great example when he would go up there and be Professor Kenney. I think at one point in the book I mentioned that he held a press conference the night before Hinshaw's address to tell Albertans the exact same thing that she was going to tell them the next day. He was like, "As you're going to hear from Hinshaw tomorrow," and it does. I do think it speaks to a certain insecurity that he has, but no, it's interesting that you say that yeah, there's almost like a sympathetic feel to the book because when I set out to write it, I was like, I don't want to humanize him. This is purely going to be about the damage he wrought throughout his political career. But once you get started writing and interviewing the few people who knew him that would talk to me, that I did, and reading about them at length, I think you do in some ways you can't help but empathize with them, even if it's someone you don't want to empathize with, even if it's someone who hates everything you like and likes everything you hate. Like I think as I wrote the book and as I developed what I was going to say beyond Jason Kenney bad, there are I think some notes of empathy or relatability that I commonality that I found. And it's almost like in some respects maybe I saw myself in him in certain ways. And I mean, throughout, I kind of saw myself in him in terms of me arriving in Alberta from Ontario in 2017 or around that time, and then sort of observing his rise and fall. But yeah, I don't know. Writing about a person, being a biographer is weird. It's funny. I and of course, he didn't talk to me, and I didn't really want to talk to him anyways. But I tried because I thought it would at least be interesting to have him answer for a few things he did. That didn't happen, but yeah, I did try and do my best to give the devil his due, if you will, and not just write a caricature of him, which I think might have been what I originally set out to do. But as you do your research, as you read more, as you talk to more people, it's like, oh, some of his quotes from when he was with the CTF were great. Um, um, I remember there's one where he was talking about This actually may have been when he was with the Reform Party, actually, because Jean Charest was leader of the PCs, the federal PCs at the time, and he was talking. And it was Charest, when he was leader of the PCs, took a hard right pivot. It was like, hey, we this is where the conservative movement is now, and we need to move rightwards to compete with reform and have a shot at forming government. And so he was talking about deficit, right? Needing to get rid of the deficit and lock up and make crime illegal. And all these conservative shibboleths. And Kenney said something like, hearing Jean Charest talk about reducing the deficit is like hearing a vampire talk about vegetarianism. I was like, that's pretty good.
I mean, he had the capacity to be funny. I don't think you can take anything away from that. He was not regularly funny. I I'm curious. The last real question that I wanted to ask you. Um, do you think that part of the reason why you were able to have a little bit of that uh, compassionate or sympathetic tone with Kenny was because my impression is when you started the book, his goose was already cooked. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. That was, it was almost as if a light bulb went off in my head when he lost the leadership review. And actually, what happened was I wrote a column for Passage, which has now been merged with the Maple, and it's the Maple's opinion section. Just it kind of irked me how Nenshi and Notley were like praising Kenney for his public service after he stepped down. Like it's not like he died. Like you know what I mean? And I mean, particularly in Notley's case, I mean, this guy outright vilified you and made you a target for abuse. And so I was just and it was a column. It was like 1,200 words about why uh Jason Kenney's political demise is good, even if what comes next is probably going to be worse. Like, let's just take a minute and engage in some Schadenfreude. And as I was writing it, I was like, holy shit, there is so much here. It was like, I could write a book about this. And then
And then you did.
that's what happened. But yeah, right. But it was in part a character study, I think. And I think that's what makes it most interesting. Because try and make this not just the story about Jason Kenney, but the story of the evolution of this conservative movement in Canada and in Alberta. But it is also a character study about, I think Clayman Haga puts it in his forward, like Jason Kenney's just a really weird guy. And, I mean, there's when sorry, I realize I didn't allow you to finish your question, but there's one anecdote. I remember reading in McLean's profile when he was the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, and it just described him staying up late in the Citizenship and Immigration Building in Ottawa, going over immigration files and blasting Gregorian chants on his iPod.
As you do.
Yeah. I mean, maybe not Gregorian chants, but
I mean, who doesn't love Gregorian chants with a little bit of policy
yeah,
reading?
it's true. It's like wine and cheese.
Yeah, that's like a Friday night for any normal person, I presume. Um, where can people get the book? I mean, I was very fortunate. I had a copy sent to me, so um, yay. But if I I do think it's for people who are wanting to understand I'll put it this way. Um, there's a book called Blue Storm, which was the follow up to the NDP, and it really does dissect the policy side and the it's a very analytical dissection of the Kenney years. There's a little bit of like flavor, but it's a very fact based. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's a very
Saying mine isn't fact based.
no. That's why I was like I shouldn't say that.
No, I'm just kidding.
Uh,
I know what you mean.
it's academic is the word I would
Yeah.
use.
And
Where
it's also there isn't, and I haven't read the entire book, but I've read some of the essays in there, and they're very good. And I think
yeah,
I
oh
cite
yeah,
some
yeah,
of
yeah,
them in my book. But it's also not like a cohesive narrative,
yes.
right?
So
Because it's
if you want to read the story of Jason Kenney, I think that the Kenneyism is it should be really considered a required reading.
I'm glad you think that, Nate.
Well, I do. And again, I mean, I'll be honest. When I started reading it, I mean, the Nobody Misses Jason Kenney. I was just like, oh, I can think of a few people who probably do, but I was very much sort of expecting the same in your writing. You can take a very what would be the word that I would use here? Aggressive uh, stance. And so I was sort of expecting this is just going to be as you said, when you first started out writing, I'm going to write about how bad Jason Kenney is. And again, what struck me and what I found uh, rewarding to read about it was that it is not just I'm going to skewer him so good. And in fact, there's you have to look for the sentiments of I'm going to skewer Jason Kenney because the rest of it really is telling the story of Jason Kenney, how he got to be where he is. And it's not as here's how I'll say it. It's not as biased as I thought it was going to be, which I actually really appreciated. And that's why I can say I think that it's an important work. I think anybody who does want to understand Jason Kenney to this point, because anyone who isn't noticing there's a little bit of a rehab tour going on. I don't think that we've seen the last of Jason Kenney in Alberta or Canadian politics by any stretch. But anybody who wants to understand the story so far, I think this is probably one of the definitive works.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nate. You can buy it wherever you buy your books. Dungeon Press is my publisher, and they've got a great distribution network. I'm really fortunate to have been published by them. And you can buy it on their website. That would probably be the most direct route. But you can also get it Amazon. But I would encourage you to get it at your local independent bookstore if you live somewhere that has a local independent bookstore. Um, and yeah, if you read it, let me know what you think. And if you liked it, give it a review on Goodreads or Amazon. And if you didn't like it, you can also give it a review, but I'm not going to specifically ask you to.
There we go. If people want to follow along with the Jeremy Appel independent journalism journey, This is where I'm going to ask you to plug your Substack and all of that. If they want to a little bit more of the aggressive tone, where do they go to find that?
Oh yeah. Well, one thing I did want to say about the tone of the book is having a good editor goes a long way to tell you can say this in a different way, or you don't need to say this. This doesn't help your argument, right? On Substack, I don't have so you can read The Orchard at readtheorchard.org. I put a lot of my journalism on there these days, and would love to have you either as a paid or unpaid subscriber. And you can find me on the former Bird site at Jeremy Appel 1025. I'm gonna be there till the ship sinks. I don't know about you, Nate.
Oh, I'll be there till the ship sinks. I mean,
Yeah.
the block list has turned into uh, quite the for the first like 4 years that we ran the show. I think we had 20 people, and last I looked, I think we're at like 3,000.
Yeah. Do you block the porn bots?
Oh yes,
Yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
that right there is like 10,000 people.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, we block those, and the rules of engagement that we have for the Twitter, because I'm not the only person who I know that there's this perception that it's all me, and as much as I'd love to take all the credit,
The the good tweets are you.
yeah, totally, totally. Um, the rules of the rules of engagement we have for blocked is that, if you engage in any sort of hate speech or anything like that, then you're toast. But as a general rule, if you're willing to engage in a good faith discussion of some kind, then okay. But if you're there to just throw ad hominem attacks or say gross things, then you're not contributing to the conversation, and that's the whole point of the thing being a thing. So that's our rules for the blocking. But yeah, no, I don't intend to see the thing with the Twitter, and I still call it the Twitter. But the thing with the Twitter
No,
for the
I do too. People who call it X, bad vibes.
yeah, no, that's like it's
Like
not
what? You think you could just buy a website and change its name? Like, yeah, I know technically you can, but
fetch isn't gonna happen.
yeah, it's Twitter. It's Twitter.
It's Twitter. That's where I mean I like some of the other apps, and we do have a little bit of a presence on some of the other apps, but the place where it all of the conversations happen is unfortunately or fortunately still the Twitter machine. And so we'll be there until uh it's not. And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'll be on it as long as everyone else is on it.
Yeah,
And then the
exactly.
second
Exactly.
everyone else isn't on it, I'll go where everyone else is.
Exactly. Yeah, because again, the whole point is to have the conversations. So if it becomes un impossible to have the conversations, we'll find somewhere where we can have the conversations. But I want to thank you for taking the time to have the chat today. And I really do. I will be 100% honest. I approached the book with a level of cautious skepticism. And I have really, really enjoyed the process of working my way through it. And I'm going to enjoy. I cheated. I read the last chapter first. I'm one of those people.
Oh, well, no, that's smart. That's what they teach you to do in graduate school. I'm serious.
Oh,
Don't
look at
you
me
don't have
go.
time because you don't have time to read like 100 books, right? So you read the intro, you read the conclusion, and then if there's a chapter that's of particular relevance to your research, you can read that chapter. You can read the beginning and end of each chapter. Like it's like that's how you pretend to the trick of the trade. That's how you pretend to read bunch of books that you haven't read in full. And that like academics just do that, right? I'm not an academic. I do try and I have this compulsion where I just want to read a book in full, but I mean a lot of academics that's what they do, right? Because if you have a course that you need to read like 20 books for, I mean, you could just pick a couple and read those, or you could read a bit of all. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I tend to I like to know where it's gonna go. is kind of my I like spoilers. And so there's with most books, there was one I read recently, the book by Maria Ressa. Um, that one I was like, nope, nope, I'm gonna do this page by page, even if it kills me. And I'm glad that I did because that was another very good book that people should read as well. Anything else you want people to hear? Anything else you want people to know? I mean, we're coming up to the almost the 2 hour mark here, so
Yeah, no, I just want to say thanks so much for having me on your show, Nate,
oh,
and for giving me this much time to ramble about Jason Kenney and Danielle Smith. And yeah, I had a great time.
cool. Well, thank you so much. And the book is once again called Kenneyism, Jason Kenney's Pursuit of Power. What silly question? What color is the cover?
Uh,
What would you call that?
well, I think that would be a gray.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
But now,
colorblind, so
oh, are you?
yeah,
Now
no.
I'm questioning myself though. But I think, yeah, it's like a gray, and then the text is a nice light blue, which I told the publisher is my favorite color. So they
There we
really
go.
came through on that.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat tonight, Jeremy.
Yeah, anytime.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.